Good afternoon, and welcome to the City Club of Portland Friday Forum. Today is Friday, March 16th, and I welcome you all to the state's premier civic affairs event. I'm Pat McCormick, President-elect of City Club, and I would like to welcome members and guests alike. Those of you who join us today at the Governor Hotel, and those of you who are listening on OPB or KBPS radio, or watching on Portland Community Media's City Center Net 30. Today we will hear about the results of and the potential impacts of the 2012 legislative session. But before we begin our program, I'd like to acknowledge City Club's corporate and media partners. They are essential to the vitality and sustainability of club activities. I'd like to thank our generous media partners, including Oregon Business Magazine. I'd also like to extend our deep appreciation to the Friday Forum corporate sponsors, Bank of the Cascades, Miller Nash, Perkins Coie, Stoll Reeves, and The Standard. We're grateful for your support and your commitment to the City Club mission. If your company or firm would like to support City Club's mission through sponsorship, please contact the friendly staff at the back of the room or call the City Club office. Can't make it to a Friday Forum? Now Friday Forums can come to you. City Club is extremely excited to announce that forums are now available on iTunes in a weekly podcast, and our new YouTube channel will offer each week's video production. Just search City Club Friday Forum to subscribe. City Club's Citizen Reads book group discusses books that focus on topics relevant to civic life. On March 21st, join the group in discussing Hope and Despair in the American City by Gerald Grant, which examines the positive impact that racial integration can have on public schools. Learn more about each of these programs on our website, pdxcityclub.org. Following today's talk, we'll be welcoming City Club members to the microphone for a question and answer session with our speakers. In addition, we invite all of our audience members to locate the index cards on your tables, write your questions on them during the forum, and hold them up when I ask. City Club staff will collect these cards, which I will then read from the microphone. We are sure you will continue to come up with great questions for today's speaker. And now to our program. The Oregon Legislature just wrapped up its first official annual session. Major education and healthcare reform bills backed by Governor Kitzhaber passed. Democrats and Republicans both claimed a number of victories on topics ranging from tax-friendly business enterprise zones to the Oregon Investment Act, but some legislators expressed concern that not enough was done to increase jobs and improve the economy. Today, in a moderated discussion led by reporter Jeff Mapes, we welcome State Senators Diane Rosenbaum and Ted Ferrioli, who will discuss the impact of the 2012 legislative session. Our program will begin with brief talks by each of our senators and then move on to a conversation between our three guests. We will close, as usual, with a question and answer session with our audience. Our first speaker today is State Senator Diane Rosenbaum. Born in Berkeley, California, Diane attended Reed College. She worked for many years at Quest and is a 28-year member of her union, the Communication Workers of America. Prior to her election to the Senate, she served for 10 years in the Oregon House, including many years in leadership positions as House Speaker and Democratic Whip. In 2008, she was elected as a state senator for District 21 in Southeast Portland and Milwaukee, and in 2009 served as State Assistant Majority Leader and as Chair of the Commerce and Workforce Development Committee. She was elected Senate Majority Leader in 2010. Our second speaker today is State Senator Ted Ferrioli. Ted received his degree in English from the University of Oregon. After graduation, he settled in Cresswell, Oregon, where he worked at the Department of Veterans Affairs. He became a member of the Cresswell City Council and served as chairman of the Budget and Police Committees. In 1986, he founded Community Relation Associates, a public relations firm dedicated to advocacy for natural resource producers. He is also a co-founder of Oregon Lands Coalition. Today he works for Timber Operators, Inc. in John Day. He has served as a senator of Eastern Oregon's District 30 since 1997 and is the Senate Republican leader. Our final guest today is Jeff Mapes, the senior political reporter at the Oregonian. Jeff has covered politics in Oregon since Ronald Reagan was running for re-election. He is a proud Westerner, but confesses to enjoying a 4-year stint as a Washington correspondent. He is the author of the OregonLive.com blog Mapes on Politics, as well as the book Peddling Revolution: How Cyclists Are Changing American Cities. And with that, please help me welcome our first speaker, Diane Rosenbaum. Senator.
Thanks a lot, Pat, and thank you, City Club members, for inviting us to tell you about our historic 2012 legislative session. As I was riding up here on the elevator, or waiting for the elevator, which wasn't working, I was talking to some of the guests downstairs, and I was saying, well, I hope this won't be too boring today. And one of them said, yeah, do you need to get in a big fight or something to liven things up? And I think that actually is a good introduction to talking about what characterized the session that we just completed, which I do think was remarkable. But sometimes people tend to think that the Senate is a little bit stodgy, a little bit boring, that we don't have those exciting shouting matches like they do in the House of Representatives that get on the front page of the paper. Or if we do, you don't usually hear so much about them. But I think what is really remarkable, and this I can say with all sincerity, that in the 2012 legislative session, particularly in the Senate, I think we were able to accomplish in a short 34-day period some of the most remarkable forward-looking pieces of legislation on the priorities that matter to Oregonians that will make this session go down in history as one that really did make a difference to our state. And I'm talking about things like standing up for all those people that are still struggling to find jobs, people who are middle-class Oregonians who've lost their home or are facing foreclosure, the small business people who've managed to withstand this recession, but just barely, and need to be able to find loans and more access to the kind of assistance that will help them create jobs. And in this session, as short though it was, I think we really moved forward on all of those areas and some others that I'm about to talk about. I want to start by talking to you about how some of these pieces of legislation came to be, because sometimes people think that the Capitol is all about lobbyists and all about things that are just pretty inside baseball. But I can tell you that I met 2 real Oregonians in January just before the session started who really did tell stories that resulted in significant legislation that passed. The first of them was a woman, middle-aged woman named Ginny Reel, who lives in Salem. Ginny came forward a little bit embarrassed at first to tell her story of how she lost her home, a home that she and her husband had owned for 20 years in Salem. She had been working, her husband had gotten very, very ill, and she had to stop working, and they fell behind on their payments. Now, this was a long-term mortgage, one where they only owed $54,000 left on it. And she began doing what people are told to do. She contacted her lending institution and tried to arrange a mortgage modification to save her home. Well, come to find out, she got the incredible runaround that you've heard so much about. On the one hand, she was being told, stop paying your mortgage. We can't really work with you on a modification until you're behind in your payments. And when she did just that and stopped making the payments, the bank moved ahead on foreclosure and, in fact, in the end, did foreclose on that home. And that became an incredible problem for her. So that is one of the thousands of stories that we've been hearing for years that resulted in the passage of what I think is probably the most significant piece of legislation, and that was a bill that will prevent that kind of dual-track process where people are doing what they think they're told to do, and yet at the same time, another part of the lending institution moves ahead and takes the home and sells it. And then the second thing the bill will do is require mandatory mediation arbitration with a neutral third-party mediator, with a requirement for the lending institution to come to a meeting with the homeowner and be prepared to modify the mortgage. It would have been great if we could have passed that bill or a bill like it back in 2007 when the housing crisis first started, and indeed we had been trying to do that for a very long time. But we listened to Ginny Reel and we got it done in 2012, and that will help potentially 13,000 or more homeowners in Oregon be able to save their homes. The second Oregonian that I met in January was a business owner named James Vandermeed, who lives in McMinnville. And he, like so many small business owners, had a pretty successful small business that was ready to expand and hire more people, but couldn't obtain financing from any lending institution. They told him that he needed a much greater amount of liquidity to be able to show that he qualified for a loan. And he was going, well, that's kind of strange, because if I had all that liquidity, I probably wouldn't need a loan to begin with. And therefore, he was struggling just to be able to stay where he was and couldn't hire any more people. And that's why we passed a very significant bill called the Oregon Investment Act, which will, with the help of State Treasurer Ted Wheeler, who did a lot of work on this, pull all of the state's economic development programs that are currently scattered in a bunch of different agencies in different places, put these together in a one-stop shop and create something called the Oregon Growth Board that will leverage both the public resources that we already have available together with private resources, and that will be able to help small business people like James stay in business, expand, and hopefully some of these businesses will become the next big businesses in Oregon that can really jumpstart our economy and put people back to work. So I think just based on those two examples, you can see that we really did pass some very significant things. One of those bills started in the House. The foreclosure legislation started in the Senate. Senator Ferrioli and I are now, I think, two of the longer-serving members, but really the Senate did some remarkable work for the first annual session. I particularly wanted to recognize Senator Peter Courtney, our Senate President, though he couldn't be here today. He really is a remarkable combination of an inimitable character, an incredible amount of leadership and drive, who knows how to bring Republicans and Democrats together and get things done. I won't have time to tell you about all the major things that we accomplished, but I think you've already heard a lot about the major steps that we took in healthcare reform and in remaking our education system. Particularly in the healthcare area, we started in 2011 by taking steps to create the Oregon Health Exchange. That is our program to implement expansion of healthcare coverage initially for individuals and for small businesses of 50 or fewer employees. We are way ahead of the curve in the country at setting up a marketplace to make insurance more affordable and more available for those groups. And in addition, the healthcare transformation legislation that we just passed will be integrating the healthcare that people currently get, starting with the Oregon Health Plan, with a focus on prevention as a way to save money and improve the quality of care. And then in the education arena, I know you've all heard much about the Oregon Education Investment Board and the Achievement Compacts, which we are now in the process of negotiating with every school district in the state to ensure a higher measure of school graduation and accountability so that we can make sure we're doing the best we can with the scarce dollars we have to fund education. I also wanted just briefly to mention a couple of things that don't get talked about a lot. One is a piece of legislation that will help those thousands of Oregonians that are still struggling to find jobs. We call it the Oregon Employment Opportunity Act, and it will prohibit advertising jobs and then saying the only people that can apply for them are people who are currently employed. That will make Oregon the second state in the country to have a law like that after New Jersey. And then I want to mention the budget, and you only have to look across the river at the dysfunctional situation in Olympia right now to know that balancing our budget and doing it with an emphasis on not cutting schools further, on preserving the critical programs that vulnerable Oregonians and small businesses need, that was a remarkable accomplishment of the 2012 session. I think in Washington they came in for 2 months, went home for a weekend, came back on Monday, and now they're still in a total dither. Much as I would love to see them successful, we were able to reach a budget agreement in a very tough time with a similar deficit and did that midway through the session. So I think you can see that we accomplished some pretty amazing things in a short period of time. I think, as you heard in the introduction from Pat, I have served in the legislature now for almost 14 years, and I haven't always been proud to get up in rooms like this and call myself a state senator. But today, meeting with you, I really am proud to be able to say that the Oregon legislature and the Senate in particular listened to people like Ginny Reel and James Vandermeed. We're going to continue to listen to those voices and stand up on the things that Oregonians really need us to make progress on. I look forward to working with you to make that kind of progress as our economy comes back to health and our state returns to prosperity, and I very much look forward to hearing your questions. Thank you for having us.
Well, I'd like to join Senator Rosenbaum in thanking you for the opportunity to be here today. My role as part of the loyal opposition is to offer a different viewpoint, and that is what I will do today. I agree with some of the things I heard today. We did an amazing amount of work in 35 days. As a matter of fact, the one thing I would tell you, if I had this to do over again, I would have recommended that our short session be 60 days. The toll on the staff and the difficulty in getting the job done in a short period of time is somewhat amazing. We did a lot of work, but really I think the unsung heroes of the legislature are not the members who went through a lot, but also and mostly the staff who had to put up with us, who had to draft our pieces of legislation, do the budgetary number crunching that's necessary. They don't get nearly enough thanks, and I would tell you they believe that it was 34 days of hell. But thank you very much for that. We did amazing things on transformation, but I will tell you that transformation of healthcare services in the state of Oregon is a very risky business. And it also connects to the balancing of the budget on a very risky basis, and I'll explain why. Transformation relies on transfers of almost $500 million from the federal government. And that transfer of funding will be on a transaction-by-transaction basis. It isn't money in the mail. It isn't an electronic transfer that helps backfill $238 million of savings that were anticipated that have not materialized. It is supposed to be $500 million that comes from providing services to folks that are getting Medicare, Medicaid, and Oregon health plan services. And in order to accomplish that kind of increase in dollars going into the state of Oregon, we have to improve the transfers through waivers and through negotiation, increasing not only the scope and nature of the kinds of things that are covered under Medicare, Medicaid, but the dollars reimbursed, to the tune of about $40 million a month additional. And the question of whether or not that will actually materialize is an open question. So I want you to understand something. Even though we did transformation, the question of whether or not transformation can be sustained, given the fact that we haven't even defined what a coordinated care organization will be or how it will function, it is a high-risk proposition. And the idea that we'll create a $500 million additional throughput from federal agencies to the state of Oregon within a one-year period is also, in my estimation, a very high-risk, very low probability equation. And remember, we have balanced our budget on that assumption. So it remains to be seen whether we have done a great deal better than the state of Washington in balancing our budget, because what we're relying on is these transfers of federal dollars related to Medicare, Medicaid, and Oregon Health Plan. We did also do the exchange. The question there, in my opinion, is whether or not by adding this exchange, which is supposed to be an opportunity for people like you, business owners and others, to go onto a matrix and determine what services and products are offered by insurance companies and how they compare on an apple-to-apple basis. That seems to be a very logical way for offering choices and a very logical way to stimulate competition within the insurance market. Ostensibly, that will produce lower cost products and more availability of products. But what remains to be seen is how we can create a new bureaucracy, use only the existing services and supplies that are available, and yet produce savings. So the exchange is going to be an experiment that we try. That will be interesting to see. In education, I think we did wonderful things for education in terms of preventing any further erosion of funding for K-12. That was, in my estimation, a recognition of the responsibility of the legislature. I also have my colleagues to thank for helping to continue the small high school subsidy that allows those small and remote high schools to keep functioning at the level that they need to produce students that have the same opportunities as all students do in the state of Oregon. So that, I think, was a real accomplishment. It was a bipartisan piece of work and very much appreciated by rural Oregon. But the idea that we would have achievement compacts that would serve in lieu of the relatively serious measurements that are going on in schools today. You know, we spend a lot of time testing for competency in reading and math. We spend a lot of time making sure that students are getting the kind of content in their schools that they need to survive and thrive and be successful in their future educational endeavors. What we're going to do is essentially negotiate waivers on the No Child Left Behind compacts and go to these achievement compacts where if schools fail, they will get counseling. Now today, if a student is in a school that is failing, that student can petition and leave that school. Or they can actually transfer to other districts when the school is letting the student down, or if you've got a school that's chronically underperforming. That is a draconian approach, I grant you that, but it has resulted in people being able to assess the quality and condition of their schools in a much more direct way. That has been very uncomfortable for folks in the state of Oregon. This move toward the Achievement Compact will be a move away from doing very strong measurements and toward a kinder, gentler approach to counseling failing students, failing schools, and failing teachers into success. I'm not sure that's going to produce the results that we need to see, which are better retention, more students graduating, higher math scores, higher reading scores, and higher matriculation into secondary education. Those are the things that we want out of our education system. And it remains to be seen whether or not we can counsel folks into that direction with achievement compacts. I agree that the foreclosure reforms are something that Oregonians needed and wanted to see. I have not been convinced by the banking institutions that they're going to actually be able to put a decision maker who can actually make a loan modification inside every single meeting that will take place on a mediation basis. As a matter of fact, it was pretty clear from testimony from the banking industry they're not going to be able to do that. And when you think about the collateralization of these loans and the securitization and the bundling and the sale to third parties, there's a lot of complexity there. And I am not sure that we're going to see a reduction of the foreclosures in the state of Oregon. As a matter of fact, what we're being told is that there are foreclosures that are sort of out there on the horizon in excess of what we've seen previously. It's a sad fact that most of the loans that are failing today will result in foreclosure, notwithstanding the fact that there may be counseling from the lender. We tried to do something about that. I just do not know that decision makers will be present in each one of those meetings, as we've heard that they will be. A couple of things that did not happen in this legislature that I think should have happened, one of which I first of all have to acknowledge and thank the City Club for bringing to the attention of the legislature, and that is a PERS reform that would flatten the assumed rate of interest from 8% to a lower rate, 6% for instance. 2 years ago, the City Club took up the issue of PERS reforms and came up with 3 or 4 of what I think are really wonderful recommendations, and one of them was we currently allow PERS employees to retire, and we assume a rate of 8% after their retirement. So it's not enough to have paid the guaranteed 8% during the entire employment period, but after they retire, we also assume an 8%. Going to 6% would save $1.7 billion. We dropped that bill in the form of Senate Bill 1593, couldn't even get a hearing. The other thing we need to do is we simply need to prohibit PERS from accepting an employee contribution from any other person but the employee. The PERS pickup has to go away. Tort reform was blocked. We're asking folks to serve Medicare, Medicaid patients that only reimburse at 65% of their cost, yet we're asking the doctors to go into those community health organizations with no liability protection from unlimited tort claims. This is utterly irrational. We asked for that bill to be moved forward. It was blocked in the legislature. So there is a different view. There are some things that we left on the table. It was a remarkable 34 days, and I, for one, am glad to see that they are over. Thank you very much.
Hi, good afternoon. Thanks so much for having me today. And before I start asking questions of the I almost said candidates. I must be in the election year. Before I ask questions of the state senators, I do have to give them, it's now required, I have to give them the PolitiFact warning, and that is that anything they say can and will be used in a PolitiFact in the Oregonian, so be careful about that. Well, let's start off. I mean, generally, both of you gave pretty good marks to the legislature, and in fact, over the last year, both this session and then the 2011 session, legislators did get pretty good grades, in fact, even including in public surveys where generally we know voters now aren't very favorable toward politicians. Given that, do you think that the legislature actually does a better job for citizens when control is divided between the two parties? And I'll start with you first, Tim.
Well, thanks for the question. Actually, we've had a lot more interesting conversations, and there's been a lot more involvement by both parties in discussions leading up to budget negotiations and discussions of critical pieces of legislation. So the thing I think to remember is that one vote literally separates us in the Senate. We are 14 to 16, but one vote can change the outcome on movement or non-movement of a bill. There has been a great deal more engagement by the majority party of minority party members, and for that we're grateful. We had a couple of chairmen of committees that were the Veterans Committee, for instance, chaired by Senator Brian Boquist. And that just makes for a better set of discussions. I think that we will continue to see closely divided Senate as we move forward. I guess I'd leave it to the citizens of the state of Oregon to decide whether or not they think that the closer the division, the better the debate. I personally think that's what happened.
Senator Rosenbaum?
Yeah, I would agree with Senator Ferrioli that we definitely have a much more functional legislature than when I was first elected. I spent the first 8 years of my career under a Republican-controlled legislature, and I can say that I virtually never got a hearing on any bill I cared about that ever came to a vote. That's how I became an expert on how to do minority reports. So I think maybe this is I think maybe this is less about partisan control than about having legislative leadership that believes that good ideas should come forward and come to a vote, no matter whether they're Democratic ideas or Republican ideas. I do think that we have a legislature, particularly in the Senate, that has a great power-sharing arrangement. I think the situation in the House, which is a historical anomaly of having an evenly divided House 30-30 for the first time in history, has been an interesting experiment, but one that's unlikely to continue. And it is pretty cumbersome to have two of everything, two chairs of every committee 2 vice chairs of every committee. It sometimes seems like there are way more chiefs than there are people actually doing the work. So I think the results speak for themselves, but as far as whether the current situation will continue, I think it's unlikely to stay the way it is in the House.
Senator Rosenbaum, I want to give you a chance to respond to some of Senator Ferrioli's, what you call it, gentle criticisms, I think. Particularly on PERS, this is an issue of particular interest to the City Club, which, as he mentioned, did quite a sweeping report on this subject, suggested several changes. Why hasn't the Senate, or put it this way, why hasn't the legislature, particularly the Democrats in the legislature, taken up some of these ideas for PERS reform, given the major funding deficit in that program?
Well, I think that's certainly a fair question. I will point out that I don't think anybody expected in a 34-day session that we were going to address changes to PERS, and in fact, there really were no serious requests for hearings on bills that I'm aware of. We did, in the last session in 2011, make a significant change, which is going forward that people who move out of Oregon will find their PERS benefits are subject to taxation. That's something that had been not done before and will, in the long term, recoup, I think, some of this deficit. But I also want to say that overall, I think our public employee retirement system, compared to other states, is very healthy. We were recently rated in the top 10 retirement systems in the country, I believe, by Standard & Poor's, for being well-funded. There always are changes we could make. I look forward to working with the City Club on some of the ideas that came out of here in the future. But I think it is important to point out that we do have an overall healthy system, and we need to be able to retain good quality teachers and firefighters and good people who could do other things, particularly educating our children. And one of the ways we do that is by a fair compensation system.
Do you have a rebuttal to that?
Thanks, I do. The idea that most of the small jurisdictions, the small special taxing districts in the state of Oregon, are literally dedicating more than a third, about a third of all of the revenue that they receive just to retire their PERS debt, makes it more and more difficult for these small districts to provide the function that they were created for. And one of the things that certainly could help in that area is the 6% pickup. If we simply said to employees, you must have some skin in the game, you must participate in helping to fund your own retirement system, and ergo, simply say to PERS, you may not accept an employee contribution from any entity other than the employee. That would help those small districts stay solvent. The assumed rate at 8% is without precedent worldwide, as far as I can see. I mean, I don't know anybody who guarantees 8% for life. 6% would save $1.7 billion. We did drop that bill. We tried to pull that bill to the floor, Senate Bill 1593. It died on a partisan vote. At the end of the day, it's the citizens of Oregon who are going to have to decide whether or not there should be a market rate for the assumed rate for PERS or something below 8%. It's simply irrational that we would guarantee 8% for life. So those are issues that I believe the next legislature has to take up.
Okay. The Supreme Court will be ruling in the next few months on the federal health care reform law. What are the consequences for the state, positive or negative, if the law is struck down, particularly the individual mandate? Why don't we start with you this time?
Yeah, the lawsuit that's being referred to by Mr. Mapes is basically the question of whether or not individuals can be ordered by their federal government to participate in a mandatory health insurance program. If the Supreme Court says no, then essentially Oregon is sort of out there with a plan that will not only start with the Medicare-Medicaid folks, but eventually be the Public Employee Benefit Board population and then the Oregon Education Investment Board population. So virtually all public participants in insurance programs will be mandated to move into this system, and eventually I don't see how the private pay folks escape being pushed into that program, because in fact even when you factor in all of the public employment as a base to build that mandatory medical care on, it may not be enough to sustain the services that will be provided. So, cost shifting has been a major feature and a major problem within all of the healthcare systems, but without the private pay somehow getting involved in this, there's probably not enough resource to support a universal healthcare system in Oregon. So if the federal court decision is that you may not mandate coverage on American citizens, then we may have to rethink the whole approach to this transformation big picture.
So will you be disappointed if the Supreme Court does strike that down?
Well, I don't know, disappointed. Look at it this way. We have balanced the budget on the basis of transformation that will produce hundreds of millions of dollars worth of savings. That's the advertisement. And we as a legislature, albeit with some negative votes, have bought into that plan. It may not work. It's a high-risk proposition, and that's not something that's hasn't been acknowledged by the governor. It is high risk. The question is whether or not it has a legal basis and whether or not it actually has a practical basis. And Oregon is a place that likes to be the first wagon on the Oregon Trail, so we're going to find out whether it works or not.
What do you think?
Well, I would say that no one can read the tea leaves to know what the Supreme Court's going to do, but I will tell you that Oregon has intervened on the side of upholding the Affordable Care Act. I just heard on NPR this morning that even states like Mississippi that are challenging the validity of the Affordable Care Act are themselves moving forward and setting up health exchanges of their own. So obviously there's a lot of belief, I think, regardless of what you think about the federal legislation, that we need a place for small businesses and individuals to be able to see health plans side by side, compare them, and that they meet minimum standards of quality and affordability. And obviously healthcare transformation needs to happen, I think, for the very reasons that Senator Ferrioli is criticizing it, that we don't have a sustainable or supportable healthcare system in this country or this state, that we need to do a better job of merging care so that we don't have kids with toothache showing up at the emergency room because they have no dental care, and that's the only place they can go when their mouths are falling apart and they can't eat anymore. And that really is the idea behind healthcare transformation and the exchange. So I think these are good ideas that Oregonians support, and I'm hopeful the Supreme Court will agree.
Since we're at the City Club and in the state's largest city, I thought it would be fun to talk a little bit about the rural economy in Oregon, which is in much tougher straits, has been for years and years. And I thought it would be interesting to start out with asking Senator Rosenbaum to sketch her vision of how you can see Oregon producing a healthy economy again for its rural areas. In fact, if you even think it's possible.
Well, I definitely do think it's possible. You know, the Senate Democratic Caucus is a very diverse group, and it includes people from places like Coos Bay, where we worked hard to set up 3 new marine reserves. We're very supportive of the expansion of enterprise zones. I think there are tough issues in terms of natural resources that will always be hard, but we are continuing to work on the water issue that Senator Ted Ferrioli mentioned earlier. I think things that I talked about today earlier, like the foreclosure law and the Oregon Investment Act, are going to provide real help to people in every district. Some of the rural districts have some of the highest foreclosure rates and some of the toughest rates of small business failure. So I think, you know, there are definitely differences between rural legislators and urban legislators, but I think on many of the things that we need to make progress on right now, we really need those things, whether you're in John Day or whether you're in inner Southeast Portland.
Did you see a vision for a healthy rural economy in that?
Actually, the problems that we're encountering are that many of the public policy issues that we've embraced over the last decade have precluded some of the development that needs to happen in rural Oregon. For instance, we debated hotly but never came to any kind of conclusion on whether or not Oregon should use the water reservations that it has within the Columbia River to start irrigating some of the croplands south of the Columbia River, as the folks on the north side have done. So there's no water withdrawal from the Columbia. The theory there is that during high peak flows in the winter, you withdraw and store water and use that water to use for irrigation in the dry summertime. And you create some of the high-value crops that Washington State's currently exporting worldwide. There's no reason why that couldn't be done in the state of Oregon. There's no additional timber harvest, either on the coastal forests or inland in the intermountain high desert area. We have terrible mortality throughout the state of Oregon. I won't belabor that point. You know it's a fact. The fact is that we are not doing anything to try to sustain timber harvesting as a viable means of community development. And it is, you know, agriculture and timber are the two things that made Oregon the great state that it is. We are nibbling at the edges on economic development. The state has changed the name of the Economic Development Organization so often, it's almost as if we put these folks in the Witness Protection Program. It's like, you know, they can't claim success, so they have to keep reorganizing and reshuffling the deck. I don't think Oregon knows very well how to do economic development, and even the creation of enterprise zones simply spends local tax dollars to try to abate taxes to attract new businesses into the communities. We still have a very high tax rate in the state of Oregon, which makes us regionally uncompetitive. We still have agencies who seem very hostile to business expansions within the state of Oregon. So I would say that we have no agenda for developing rural economic stability. And until we do, you folks in the urban areas are going to export resources to the rural areas on a formula basis. And it used to be the other way around. Oregon's rural communities used to help sustain all of Oregon infrastructure and education and transportation networks. Today, the economic engine of the state of Oregon is the I-5 corridor, and you are exporting your resources into the rural areas to sustain infrastructure that's relatively unsustainable because of our public policy. Thank you.
Oregon has set very high educational achievement goals that everybody will graduate from high school, 80% will go on beyond that to some advanced education. Is it realistic to think that we can do this without investing a lot more money in our education system? Start with you this time.
I don't think it is, to be perfectly honest with you. The bar that we have set, the 40-40-20, is a high bar, but the sad fact is that we wouldn't have had to set that bar unless our statistical production was something that's a relic from the previous century. I graduated in 1969 from U.S. Grant High School here in Portland, and only 30% of the student body went on to higher education then. The statistic today is almost identical. So in that period of 40 years, we really haven't made any progress toward inspiring kids to go on to higher ed, you know, catching them on fire in terms of the excitement that should come in education and the dedication that should come with the ideal that they've picked a career path. And so, you know, we don't seem to be making any progress there, and I'm not sure whether it's a financial or a human resource question. Every time we seem to get close to getting the answer to what it is that will improve education, whether it's better testing or more reporting or connecting student performance with teacher performance, we seem to reorganize education. And we've done that again. We're now in the process of reorganizing education rather than really looking at what is happening in classrooms and what is happening in schools that is acting not so much to move kids forward in their educational career and attainment, but is impeding that process.
Senator Rosenbaum?
Well, I think it's crucial that we set high goals, and I don't think that it is the whole answer. I do think that we have not been doing a good enough job of funding our schools for a very long time in this state, going back to when Ballot Measure 5 passed in 1990. I think it's remarkable that we still have most people wanting to send their kids to public schools because they know they can get a good education there. But if we don't succeed in higher graduation rates and in having programs available from pre-kindergarten to higher education that train people and educate them for the good jobs that are here, so we don't have the intels going out of state and even out of the country to find people that they need. We will never really come back to the kind of prosperity that Oregonians expect. I don't think there's a single more important thing we could be committed to long term than remaking our education and workforce training system. When my dad was a kid growing up on the Lower East Side and had no hope of going to college, it was a teacher who fed him and pulled him out of the dumbbell class and enabled him to become a high school math teacher. That's the kind of schools I want to see our kids going to here in Oregon.
I want to thank our panel. I want to thank our panel for an interesting and informative discussion. And now, if you have a written question, please hold up the index card and City Club staff will come and collect them from you. Thank you very much. The first question for our speakers, as always, will be from our Friday Forum host, Mac Prichard. Mac Prichard is the founder and president of Prichard Communications, a public relations and social media firm. Mac joined City Club in 2004, served on the Agora Committee for 2 years, and joined the Board of Governors in 2010, and is currently the Secretary of the Board. Mac?
Thank you, Pat, and thank you, Senators Rosenbaum and Ferrioli. This was the first annual session for the legislature, and Senator Ferrioli, you talked a little bit about your reactions to that. I'd like to ask you both, what do you think worked well and in this experiment, and what changes do you think the legislature should make, if any, the next time around, aside from looking at perhaps lengthening the session?
Well, I'll go first. I mean, there really is no way to lengthen the session because when you approved it, when voters approved this measure, we have a constitutional limit now of 35 days in the short session and 160 days in the long session. And it would take a 2/3 vote of both bodies to extend that, and that's pretty unlikely to happen. I think, as I said earlier, think this session worked very well. It was kind of a roller coaster ride to the finish. And on the very last day, the 34th day, we not only passed the major budgets, we passed foreclosure, we passed 2 of the education bills that we were talking about, and we passed the major health exchange bill. So we got it done. I would say probably more work will have to happen, and we've already been moving to this in between sessions where we're really engaged with civic groups like the City Club and make sure we work through some of the tough issues like the water issue, because it's just not possible to try to resolve and negotiate all these hard problems in such a short period of time. So I think working more in between sessions to engage the public and the legislature on the tough problems.
Thank you, Diane. From my perspective, focus was the thing that worked in the Senate. We all realized that if your proposal had not had a hearing or moved in some fashion by the 8th calendar day, it wasn't going to move. So, after 8 days, if you're not working with the other chamber on, the way forward for your concept, it was dead. Likewise, I think the folks in the House came late to the realization that if they hadn't got something going on the 8th day, it was not going to go anywhere, and that created a little disconnect. The things that I think could have been done better, we are really going to have to work harder on pre-session filing, on interim work, on interim research. We're going to have to work better and more diligently on engaging the public. Because when on the 8th day you go to 1 hour notice for public hearings, you're very likely precluding any meaningful public input on fairly significant changes that came out of this legislative process. So many folks, I think, felt foreclosed from the opportunity of being able to engage with legislators and to have the kind of public debate. And if we're going to cure that in future short sessions, we're going to have to engage people and invite them early, get them scheduled early so that their public input can be made part of the public record.
We will now take questions from the floor. As always, we invite members to the microphone to ask their question. Asking questions at the Friday Forum microphone is a privilege of City Club membership. Before asking any questions, please identify yourself as a City Club member and ask your question in 30 seconds or less. If I flash this famous question mark card, it means please wrap up your question. I will also try to read at least one audience member index card question.
Member Anthony Petchel with Bank of the Cascades, one of the sponsors. My question is around the budget. Our budget issues that you recently addressed are not going away in future years. What steps are you seeing the legislative body take towards addressing some of our ballot measures that have really tied your hands as far as making budgetary decisions?
I'll go ahead and take a bite of that. We do and have a very serious budgetary shortfall that we'll be facing in the next legislative session. It may be as much as $1 billion. So the one thing that we did to address that during this legislative session was almost unprecedented. We cut positions. You know, this is the first time in my memory that we can actually point to an area where about $25 million worth of actual currently held positions were eliminated from the budget. We need to do more of that. Oregon simply spends more than it takes in. That spending is unsustainable, and those are issues that we're going to have to deal with more and more in the future. In terms of how we were constrained by the initiative process, we certainly have the sentencing issues. We also have many other mandates that have been imposed over time by the electorate, and those mandates are inescapable. So I think it's our responsibility as legislators to figure out how to make decisions within the framework, not ignore the mandates.
And it's a great question about the initiative process and the stability of our funding system. I think that in terms of the budget itself, we are going to continue to be facing challenges in the short term. And clearly, we have to do what we just did and be more accountable and more careful, wise stewards of the tax dollars that we have right now. I didn't have time to talk about things that we did in the area of public contracting, like making sure that we get a better bang for the buck out of the contracts that we put out in the private sector by prohibiting contractors from developing a contract and then bidding on it, things like that. But I think in terms of the initiative process, City Club's obviously done a lot of work on that. There's probably one single change that we could make but haven't been able to agree on, and that is to have, as part of what voters see in an initiative, not only the result of a yes and no vote, but if it costs money, where is that money going to come from? Because part of the problem is we keep passing things that require devastating cuts to other parts of the budget, and voters never get to make a decision. Do they actually want to cut schools in order to build more prisons? So I think being able to put that kind of information as part of what voters get to look at on their ballot would really help.
And let me add one thing to that. As difficult as this process was, we neither cut schools nor closed prisons, and we did not raise taxes. So, you know, I'm just pointing out there are other alternatives than the dichotomy between do you close schools or do you close prisons or do you raise taxes. There are other choices that the legislature made this cycle.
Virginia Cornyn, City Club member. A piece of the infrastructure that I didn't hear either of you mention, but I believe are drivers of both educational achievement and economic development, is the internet. There are a number of parts of the state of Oregon which do not have a high-speed pipe and can only access via dial-up, which essentially means that they have no access to the resources they need. Has that been worked in the legislature, or is that something that's being planned to work in the legislature in the future?
I'm a member of the Oregon Broadband Advisory Council, and it's an issue that is being actively studied by the legislature as a result of a piece of legislation from the previous session. And that committee's charge is to analyze access and to map access and to make sure that it makes recommendations to the legislature specifically to address the needs assessment and the gap analysis. The other thing that we did was we took forthright action on tax assessment of one of the major internet providers that was caught up in a unitary assessment tax argument with our Department of Revenue. We resolved that in the favor of the internet provider and hope that that will cause more internet providers to take a hard look at Oregon for expansion of their businesses. Essentially, I believe we are looking at providing answers to some of the questions about do all Oregonians have equal access to the internet? Thank you.
My name is Steve Katz. I'm a member of the City Club. And coming down here, I listened to Science Friday on NPR. And one of the things they talked about was science abilities of students and the fact that they really don't need to have a four-year education, that there needs to be some place between high school and university level to get those scientific and technical skills. So I was just wondering if in the education bill or legislation there was any mention or note of that. Thank you.
Well, that's a great question. I do think it's really important in that 4420 goal that part of it is that people have access to advanced training beyond high school that doesn't necessarily have to be a four-year college degree, but could be things like an apprenticeship program or a community college degree. And so clearly, I think there are places where people can get the kind of skills and training for good jobs. And some of that is expanding programs in our community colleges, which we've been trying really hard to do. So I think the workforce programs have a huge potential. I just heard yesterday that we just got a $9.5 million federal grant for workforce retraining programs here in the Tri-County area. So I think there's a lot of interest in other kinds of alternatives to conventional four-year education that we are going to have to pursue, working with our large employers and the institutions that we have.
I think that we really need to be honest about the fact that we've de-emphasized trade school education, that we've defunded and essentially let languish those trade schools that used to be a part of every high school opportunity. We also have, in our zeal to protect young people from work experience that might put them in jeopardy of some kind, we really don't have the kind of job shadowing and apprenticeship programs and welcoming attitude that we used to young people entering the workforce at 15 and 16 and 17 years. So those are the kind of things that we really need to look at in terms of trends in our society and make some decisions about whether or not we can provide those same kinds of opportunities that get kids excited about an alternative path to success, not necessarily in a four-year college. I don't know how that's going to happen.
Wynn Wakala, excuse me, City Club member, and also Executive Director for FAST, which stands for Fight Against Sex Trafficking. One of the things we've found out about people who have been victims of sex trafficking is that 85 to 90% have already been victimized before they got into that. My question is, looking at the Finnish model of schools, the first thing they do is emphasize protecting the child, making sure the child is taken care of. And I noticed in the legislature of this current season, there was a bill that came up to make mandatory reporting for child abuse, and it got greatly watered down, and I wondered about that. And I also wonder, I know our Constitution protects freedom of speech here more in Oregon than other states, but our kids can't go to X-rated movies, so why do they have to walk past X-rated exotic businesses on the way to school? So I'd like those two things answered, please.
Well, I think that's several questions, so I'll try to answer a couple of them. We actually have, I think, taken significant steps, particularly in the last couple of years, to try to crack down on sex trafficking of underage kids in Oregon, and particularly girls. I know, are working with the Oregon Liquor Control Commission on publicizing 800 numbers for young people to be able to call for help when they don't know where to turn for help. In 2011, we significantly increased penalties for prostitution and took away defenses such as not knowing that the victim was underage, so we toughened up our laws. Your last question is probably a harder one as far as zoning of adult businesses. That has tended to be a constitutional question in Oregon, which I think has been put before voters as far as amending the Constitution in terms of free speech. So I don't really have a great answer for your zoning and kids having to walk by adult businesses.
It's my impression that we did expand mandatory reporting requirements or mandatory reporting populations in this last legislative session. And, you know, that's been a constant trend, is to expand who must report. So I believe that's helpful, because I think the majority of reports of abuse do come from mandatory reporters. I think we established, as a matter of fact, I may have read that in PolitiFact. Anyway, and we have wrestled with the idea. Oregon is a very strong free speech state, but we have wrestled with the idea of allowing local authorities, the zoning authority, to make sure that, for instance, adult businesses are not sited within 1,000 feet of a school. I mean, there are, you know, we have wrestled with that issue. I don't know if we've come to what you'd consider to be the perfect solution, but we're trying to figure out ways in which, without stepping on people's First Amendment rights, we're also giving them peace of mind in their communities. It's a difficult issue.
We have run out of time for further questions, and we'll have to stop for the day. Please join us next week for the long-anticipated State of the County speech with Multnomah County Chair Jeff Kogan. And as we close for today, please join me in offering sincere thanks to today's speakers, State Senators Ted Ferrioli, Diane Rosenbaum, and Jeff Mapes.